The moment I saw the HOA president's pristine black SUV inching onto my perfectly manicured lawn, my blood boiled in a way that only years of pent-up frustration and silent neighborly injustice could provoke. She parked there as if the no trespassing sign, the freshly painted boundary markers, and my very presence in my own yard were invisible, and I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with calculated rage as I watched her step out, heels clicking with that condescending confidence, clipboard in hand, ready to lecture me about some arbitrary rule she had personally invented that week. And I knew in that instant that this would not be another quiet confrontation where I would simply nod, apologize, or tolerate her overreach. I had spent too long biting my tongue while she and her minions wove a web of petty fines, veiled threats, and neighborhood intimidation. And now, finally, I was ready to escalate in a way she would never see coming, starting with the cans of industrial strength expanding foam I had acquired under the guise of a weekend home improvement project. Secretly smiling as I pictured the shock on her face when she discovered her vehicle completely encapsulated in the sticky, white mess, unable to move, unable to escape. And suddenly I was moving with the precision of someone who had spent weeks planning every detail, every angle, from the best time of day to the exact trajectory of the spray nozzle, calculating the exact amount of foam needed to cover the tires, the doors, the windows, and yet leave no obvious fingerprints or evidence linking me to the act. All while the HOA president stood there chatting idly on her phone, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon her. And as I approached the car, crouching low to avoid her line of sight, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum, I felt a mixture of fear, exhilaration, and pure satisfaction at the thought of turning the tables, of taking control in a world where she had always wielded power with impunity. And as I squeezed the trigger on the first canister, releasing a stream of thick, expanding foam that hissed and bulged as it adhered to her hood, I couldn't help but let out a quiet laugh, the sound muffled by the roar of her engine already sputtering, her hand still raised mid-gesture as if frozen in disbelief, and from that moment, every second stretched into a surreal, cinematic experience as I worked systematically, spraying, layering, sculpting the foam to ensure maximum immobilization, the sticky white substance creeping over mirrors, headlights, and windshield wipers in a horrifyingly beautiful chaos that reflected the years of injustice I had endured silently while she strutted through our neighborhood like a queen with a crown made of petty regulations. And with each passing minute, I watched her eyes widen as she tried to open the door, tug at the handle, and then finally, step back to take in the full horror of her predicament, phone still clutched in one hand as she finally realized that nothing short of calling a tow truck, or perhaps the fire department, would free her from the white tomb that now held her pride and her SUV hostage. And as neighbors began to gather, some whispering, some filming, some openly laughing, I felt a rush of vindication that coursed through my veins with every heartbeat, a vindication that no HOA letter, no fine, no arbitrary mandate could ever take away, and yet amidst the triumph, a flicker of fear lingered in the back of my mind because I knew this action would ignite an escalation that could reach far beyond lawn disputes, potentially dragging in lawyers, local news crews, and perhaps even law enforcement. But even as the magnitude of what I had done settled over me like a thick fog, I could not suppress the sense of justice I felt in my chest, the long overdue retribution for countless afternoons spent mowing under scrutiny, for countless nights spent worrying over phantom fines, and for every snide remark the HOA president had made under the guise of community standards. And as I stepped back, brushing a streak of foam off my jeans, watching the sticky mess bulge and harden with the slow inevitability of a trap snapping shut, I realized that this singular act, this artistic, mischievous, and fully justified expression of rebellion, was more than just revenge. It was a statement, a warning, and a declaration of independence from the petty tyranny that had long ruled our little corner of the world. And as she shouted, frantically trying to phone for help, gesturing wildly as the crowd of neighbors grew, taking videos, murmuring in awe and amusement, I felt the full weight of the moment, knowing that from this point forward, the HOA president would think twice before treating my property, or me, with anything less than respect. And as I walked away, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and trepidation, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the ripple effects of this act would spread far beyond a single lawn, igniting a chain reaction of confrontation, strategy, and clever maneuvering, all while I remained calm, confident, and in complete control of the narrative I had created, one layer of foam, one stunned expression, and one victorious smirk at a time. The chaos truly began about 10 minutes after the foam finished expanding and hardened into what looked less like a prank and more like a modern art installation dedicated to spite, because that was when the HOA president finally found her voice and unleashed it on the neighborhood like a siren, her shrill shouting slicing through the air as she demanded to know who had vandalized her vehicle, completely ignoring the small but inconvenient fact that she had illegally parked it squarely on my private lawn, crushing fresh grass I had spent weeks nurturing. And as she stormed back and forth in front of the immobilized SUV, heels slipping slightly on the hardened foam blobs that had oozed onto the driveway edge, I noticed something remarkable happening around us. Neighbors who had spent years keeping their heads down, avoiding eye contact, and quietly paying ridiculous fines were slowly emerging from their houses, phones raised, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen before, hope, mixed with disbelief, as if they were watching a myth come to life, the untouchable HOA president finally facing consequences. And when she spotted me standing calmly near my porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable, she marched toward me with the fury of someone who had never been told no in her life, accusing me loudly, publicly, and repeatedly, threatening lawsuits, police reports, emergency HOA meetings, and lifetime bans from community privileges, each word dripping with entitlement and desperation. But I said nothing at first, letting her rant burn itself out while the cameras rolled, because silence in moments like that is power. And when she finally paused to catch her breath, I calmly pointed out, loud enough for everyone recording, that her vehicle was trespassing, that I had previously warned her in writing not to enter my property, and that any damage to her car was a direct consequence of her own illegal actions, which caused a ripple through the crowd as neighbors murmured and nodded, some even pulling out their own old HOA notices as if remembering years of similar harassment. And that was when she realized she was losing control, her face flushing red as she pulled out her phone and dialed someone, probably the police, though she announced it theatrically like a threat. And as we waited, the expanding foam continued to cure, tightening its grip around the tires like concrete, sealing the doors shut, crawling up the sides of the vehicle in frozen waves. And I couldn't help but notice how the once polished SUV now looked ridiculous, humiliated, stripped of its authority just like its owner. And when the police cruiser finally arrived, lights flashing lazily rather than urgently, the officer stepped out, took one look at the scene and paused longer than usual, clearly trying to process the absurdity of a luxury SUV entombed in white foam while half a neighborhood filmed from every angle. And the HOA president immediately launched into her rehearsed narrative, painting herself as the victim of a malicious, unhinged homeowner, conveniently skipping over the trespassing part. But the officer, to his credit, asked simple questions first. Where was the car parked, who owned the property, and whether there was any signage indicating private land. And when I calmly answered, providing printed copies of my property survey, prior HOA warnings, and even timestamps of her previous violations, the balance of power visibly shifted, her voice growing sharper, more frantic as she interrupted repeatedly, digging herself deeper with every word, until the officer finally held up a hand and told her to stop, a moment so rare and satisfying that several neighbors audibly gasped. And then came the sentence that changed everything. Ma'am, you are parked on private property without permission, delivered flatly, professionally, and without drama. Yet it hit her harder than any insult could, because it shattered the illusion that her HOA title granted her authority everywhere. And as the officer continued explaining that this was a civil matter at best and that vandalism claims would be difficult given her trespassing, her confidence crumbled further, her threats dissolving into sputtered protests, while I stood there quietly, watching years of unchecked power drain from her posture. And when she demanded the HOA would fine me, the officer replied that HOA rules did not override property law, a statement that sent a visible jolt through the crowd, neighbors exchanging looks like prisoners realizing the bars weren't as strong as they'd been told. And then came the tow truck, summoned not to punish me but to remove her car, only for the driver to laugh outright upon seeing the foam, shaking his head as he explained that towing it like this would cause more damage and that removal would require specialized equipment at her expense, which pushed her over the edge entirely, her voice cracking as she accused everyone, me, the neighbors, the police, of conspiring against her, and yet no one stepped forward to support her, not a single HOA board member in sight, because bullies rarely inspire loyalty, only fear, and once that fear breaks, there's nothing left. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across my lawn and the foam-covered monument to arrogance, I felt the weight of the moment settle in, realizing that this wasn't just about a car or a prank anymore. It was about exposure, about revealing how fragile her authority truly was. And when she finally stormed off in a rideshare, leaving her prized SUV behind like a fallen statue, the neighborhood didn't disperse right away. People lingered, talking quietly, sharing stories of fines, threats, and intimidation. And for the first time, I saw something shift in their expressions, a collective understanding that power only exists when people believe in it, And as I went inside that evening, closing the door on the muffled sounds of conversation and distant laughter, I knew that the HOA president wouldn't let this go, that retaliation would come swiftly and aggressively, but I also knew something else, something far more important. The spell had been broken, and once that happens, no amount of emergency meetings, legal threats, or carefully worded notices can ever fully restore the illusion of control she had just lost on my lawn, entombed in expanding foam for everyone to see. By the next morning, before the sun had fully burned the fog off the street, retaliation arrived exactly the way I knew it would, not with subtlety or intelligence, but with paperwork, posturing, and a desperate attempt to reassert control. Because taped directly to my front door was an emergency HOA violation notice, printed in bold red letters, accusing me of vandalism, harassment, creating a public nuisance, and somehow, impressively, unauthorized lawn modifications, as if my grass itself had committed a crime. And I laughed out loud when I read it, a deep, uncontrollable laugh that came from the realization that she was panicking, flailing, throwing every accusation she could think of at the wall to see what might stick. And as I stood there holding the notice, coffee steaming in my other hand, I could already see the neighborhood reacting, curtains shifting, phones raised again, whispers traveling faster than the HOA email blasts ever could, because she had made her next mistake. She had CC'd the entire community, and now everyone could see the accusations for what they were, exaggerated, unhinged, and conveniently silent on the issue of her trespassing. And when the emergency HOA meeting was announced for that evening, mandatory attendance or fines would be issued. I knew this was the stage she intended to reclaim her authority, to stand at the front of the clubhouse like a wounded general and reframe the narrative before it slipped completely out of her grasp. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that while she had been screaming into her phone the night before, I had been making calls of my own, quiet ones, strategic ones, to a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA overreach, to the county zoning office, and to a civil engineer who confirmed something I had suspected for months. The HOA had been enforcing rules well beyond its legal jurisdiction, including parking enforcement on private lots and issuing fines without proper hearings, and as that information settled in, the situation transformed from a petty neighborhood feud into something far more dangerous for her, because people who abuse small power often do so carelessly, leaving a trail of violations behind them, and by the time I walked into the clubhouse that evening, the room was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, the air thick with tension and anticipation, and there she was at the front, posture rigid, expression carefully rehearsed to project authority she no longer fully possessed, launching into her speech about community standards and dangerous behavior, without once acknowledging the laughter, the murmurs, the eye rolls spreading through the crowd. And when she finally opened the floor for discussion, confident no one would dare challenge her publicly, I raised my hand calmly, deliberately, and the room went quiet in a way that made her visibly flinch, because she knew this wasn't a private email she could ignore or a fine she could quietly issue. This was a public confrontation, and when she reluctantly acknowledged me, I stood and spoke clearly, slowly, laying out the facts without emotion, that she had parked on my private property without permission, that I had documented warnings, that the police had confirmed her trespass, and that the HOA had no legal authority to enforce parking rules on my lot. And as I spoke, I watched her expression shift from smug irritation to tight-lipped fear, especially when I mentioned that my attorney would be reviewing the HOA's enforcement practices for compliance with county and state law, because that was when the room changed, neighbors leaning forward, suddenly alert, suddenly interested, and then something unexpected happened. Another homeowner stood up, then another, and another, each sharing their own story of overreach, fines issued without hearings, threats made without justification, selective enforcement that always seemed to favor board members and punish anyone who questioned them. And with each story, her authority crumbled further, her attempts to interrupt shut down by the sheer volume of voices she had suppressed for years. And when someone asked whether the HOA even had the right to issue certain fines, she snapped that this meeting was out of order, a phrase that only exposed how little control she actually had left. And when I calmly requested that the HOA's bylaws be produced on the spot, specifically the sections granting enforcement authority, the silence that followed was deafening, because no one at the front table could produce them, not the treasurer, not the secretary, not even her. And that was the moment, the precise moment, when fear crossed her face, real fear, not embarrassment or anger, but the realization that she had built her reign on intimidation rather than legality, and intimidation collapses the second someone stops being afraid. And as the meeting dissolved into chaos, with neighbors demanding audits, elections, and resignations, I realized that the expanding foam on her car had only been the spark, the absurd, unforgettable image that woke people up, but the fire now spreading through the HOA was fueled by years of resentment, quietly waiting for permission to ignite, and when she finally stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her as voices followed, calling for accountability, I didn't feel triumph so much as calm, the calm that comes from knowing the outcome is no longer in doubt. And later that night, as I stood by my window watching the foam-covered SUV still sitting there under the streetlight like a monument to hubris, I understood something deeply important. This was no longer about revenge, it was about exposure, about stripping away the illusion of power and forcing everything into the open, where rules had to be justified, authority had to be earned, and bullies could no longer hide behind clipboards and titles. And as my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors thanking me, asking questions, seeking guidance, I knew the final act was approaching, because when people like her lose control publicly, they don't retreat quietly, they make one last, reckless move, and I was ready for it. The last reckless move came faster than I expected, arriving not with another notice or meeting announcement but with a lawsuit, an oversized envelope delivered by courier, stamped urgent, packed with legal language so aggressive it practically shouted through the paper, accusing me of malicious destruction of property, intentional emotional distress, defamation, and interference with HOA operations. And I knew the moment I finished reading it that this wasn't a real attempt to win in court but a bluff, a pressure tactic designed to scare me into backing down before the deeper scrutiny exposed everything she had been hiding, because people who truly believe in their legal standing don't panic file kitchen sink lawsuits. And as word spread through the neighborhood that she was suing, I watched fear try to creep back in, some neighbors retreating behind curtains again, others texting me in hushed tones asking if this meant things would go back to how they were, and that was when I realized this phase wasn't about clever retaliation anymore, it was about endurance, about standing firm while the bully threw their final tantrum, and I responded the only way that actually works, with patience, preparation, and absolute transparency, because within 48 hours, my attorney had filed a calm, devastating response that didn't insult her, didn't escalate emotionally, but simply dismantled her claims line by line, attaching police incident numbers, property surveys, time-stamped warnings, video footage from half the neighborhood, and most importantly, a counterclaim that alleged abuse of authority, selective enforcement, and financial misconduct pending discovery, and discovery is the word that terrifies people like her, because it means records, emails, bank statements, minutes, and side deals dragged into daylight. And when the notice of the counterclaim circulated, something remarkable happened. The HOA board fractured, the treasurer resigned for personal reasons, the secretary stopped responding to emails, and suddenly the president who once strutted through the neighborhood issuing fines couldn't even get quorum for an emergency vote. And then the county zoning office followed up on the inquiry I'd quietly triggered days earlier, confirming in writing that the HOA had indeed been enforcing parking and property use rules outside its legal authority for years, which meant refunds, invalid fines, and potential penalties. And when that letter reached the board, panic set in fully, because now it wasn't just me pushing back, it was the county, the courts, and the collective memory of a neighborhood realizing it had been milked under false pretenses. And the final humiliation came when local media picked up the story, not because I called them, but because a neighbor did, framing it not as man vandalizes car, but as HOA president accused of overreach after illegally parking on private property, complete with a blurred image of the foam-covered SUV that by now had become infamous. And as reporters requested comment, she went silent, no statements, no emails, no posts, just absence. And absence is loud when someone has spent years demanding attention and obedience. And by the time the SUV was finally removed at her expense, cut free in chunks, paint ruined, resale value destroyed, the symbolism was unavoidable. Every layer of foam peeled away revealed the cost of unchecked arrogance. And standing there watching the cleanup crew work, neighbors gathered again, not laughing this time but talking openly, organizing, planning elections, audits, reforms, and I realized that this section of the story wasn't about a prank escalating into chaos, it was about the moment power permanently shifted hands, when fear stopped working, when threats lost their edge, and when the person who once ruled by intimidation found herself isolated, exposed, and legally cornered. And as I walked back onto my lawn, unchallenged, uncontested, I knew the battle wasn't over yet, that she still had one last option left, the most dangerous one of all, because when people lose power, money, and reputation all at once, they don't always choose dignity, they choose desperation. And Section 5 would begin exactly where desperation turns into a fatal mistake. Desperation has a sound, and I heard it at exactly 2:17 a.m. when my phone exploded with alerts from the security cameras, A rapid-fire cascade of motion notifications that jolted me awake and sent a cold spike of awareness straight through my chest. Because nothing good ever happens in a quiet neighborhood at that hour unless someone is actively trying to make something very bad look accidental. And as I pulled up the live feed, there she was, the former HOA president herself, standing at the edge of my lawn under the sickly yellow glow of the streetlight, hood up, posture tense, looking nothing like the authoritative tyrant she once played so effortlessly, but instead like someone who had crossed the invisible line between reckless and irrational, and I watched in stunned silence as she crept forward carrying a red gas can, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, clearly believing that darkness and past intimidation would still protect her, and in that moment the entire conflict crystallized into something far more serious than fines, meetings, or lawsuits, because this wasn't about control anymore. It was about erasing evidence, rewriting the narrative through destruction, and maybe even forcing me into silence through fear. And instead of rushing outside or confronting her directly, which every instinct screamed at me to do, I did the one thing she never anticipated. I let the cameras roll, called the police, and stayed exactly where I was, because the most dangerous mistakes are made when people believe no one is watching. And as the dispatcher stayed on the line, I narrated calmly, describing her appearance, her movements, the gas can, the direction she was heading, and when she reached the spot where her SUV had once sat, now empty but still scarred with foam residue and tire marks, she paused, visibly confused, pacing in tight circles as if trying to decide what to do next, and that hesitation saved her from crossing a line she could never return from, because moments later squad cars rolled in silently, lights off until the last second, surrounding her before she could react, and the look on her face when she realized she wasn't in control, not of the story, not of the situation, not of anything, was something I will never forget, a raw mixture of shock, rage, and terror that stripped away the last remnants of her constructed authority. And as officers detained her, questioning her about trespassing, attempted arson, and violation of a temporary restraining order she apparently hadn't even bothered to read, the reality of her choices finally caught up with her in a way HOA bylaws never could, and the next morning the neighborhood woke up to flashing lights, police tape, and a rumor mill running faster than ever. But this time the facts were undeniable, because footage circulated, arrest records surfaced, and the woman who once fined people for trash cans being out 5 minutes late was now facing charges that could end her career, her finances, and her freedom. And as investigators widened their inquiry, they didn't stop with that night. They dug into everything: the HOA accounts, the enforcement patterns, the vendor kickbacks, the mysteriously inflated legal fees, and suddenly the lawsuit she had filed against me looked less like an offensive maneuver and more like a desperate distraction. And neighbors who once whispered now spoke openly, some even apologizing for not standing up sooner, while others admitted they had paid fines they never owed just to avoid her wrath. And through it all I stayed calm, cooperative, and quiet, because nothing unnerves a collapsing tyrant more than the realization that the person they tried to crush doesn't need to gloat, threaten, or escalate. They just need to let the truth do its work. And as the days passed, restraining orders were issued, emergency HOA elections were scheduled, and her name was quietly removed from every official document like a stain someone hoped would fade if ignored. I understood that Section 5 wasn't about victory in the traditional sense. It was about the moment when intimidation finally turned inward, when the fear she had wielded for years rebounded and trapped her in its jaws. And as I stood on my lawn one evening, breathing in the calm that had once felt impossible, I knew the story still wasn't finished, because fallout doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in waves, and the next wave would hit where she least expected it. Her money, her allies, and the carefully built illusion that she had ever been untouchable. The financial fallout began quietly, almost politely, the way truly devastating consequences usually do, with a single certified letter delivered to every homeowner announcing a temporary freeze on HOA accounts pending audit. And that was when the panic spread in earnest, because money is the last illusion people cling to when power and reputation are gone. And suddenly neighbors who had never cared how dues were spent were demanding spreadsheets, invoices, contracts, and explanations, discovering for the first time that the HOA's books were a maze of vague line items, recurring consulting fees, and vendor payments that never quite matched any work anyone could remember being done. And as the independent auditor, hired by a board that was scrambling to prove it wasn't complicit, started pulling threads, the sweater unraveled fast, revealing years of padded legal retainers, landscaping contracts awarded to relatives, and emergency expenditures approved without votes, all signed off by the same confident hand that once slapped violation notices on windshields. And when the preliminary findings were shared in a packed community meeting, the room went silent in a way that felt heavier than any shouting ever had, because numbers don't yell or threaten, they simply exist, undeniable and merciless, and the total, 6 figures quietly siphoned under the banner of community management, landed like a physical blow, and that was when former allies distanced themselves. Overnight, board members who once nodded along suddenly claiming ignorance, vendors canceling contracts, and lawyers advising silence, while the woman at the center of it all retreated completely, no statements, no posts, no appearances, as if vanishing might undo years of signatures and emails. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone that the same HOA that once fined residents for mismatched curtains was now scrambling to justify missing funds. And as refunds began to be discussed, real money returning to real people, the atmosphere shifted from anger to resolve, neighbors organizing committees, rewriting bylaws, and insisting on transparency clauses that would have been unthinkable months earlier. And through it all I stayed in the background, attending meetings, answering questions when asked, but never positioning myself as a hero, because movements fail when they hinge on one person, and this wasn't about me anymore. It was about restoring a balance that should never have been lost. And when the lawsuit against me was quietly withdrawn without prejudice, replaced instead by settlement talks that went nowhere because her side had nothing left to bargain with, it became clear that the last leverage she had tried to wield, fear through legal pressure, was gone too, and the final confirmation came when the auditor's report was forwarded to the county prosecutor, not with drama or announcement, but as a routine referral, the bureaucratic equivalent of a door closing forever. And as the neighborhood absorbed what that meant, the mood transformed again, this time into something almost unfamiliar. Relief, the kind that comes when a constant pressure finally lifts and people realize how heavy it had been all along, and standing there listening to neighbors talk about gardens, block parties, and projects that had been shelved for years because the HOA wouldn't allow it. I understood that Section 6 wasn't about punishment, it was about recovery, about reclaiming a community that had been reduced to compliance and restoring it to something human. And yet even in that calm, a final tension lingered, because accountability doesn't end with audits and referrals, it ends when consequences are fully realized, and somewhere beyond the neat rows of houses and newly planted lawns, a reckoning was still moving forward, slow but inevitable, and I knew the last chapters would be quieter, heavier, and far more permanent than any foam-covered car ever could be. By the time Section 7 of this saga unfolded, the neighborhood had transformed from a quiet, subdued suburb into a living case study in accountability, because what had begun as a prank, a single SUV immobilized with expanding foam, had spiraled into an irreversible chain reaction of exposure, legal scrutiny, financial collapse, and personal reckoning, and by now the former HOA president, once untouchable and brazen, had become a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, her name invoked with a mixture of disbelief, incredulity, and a grudging sense of justice. And as I walked down the street one crisp morning, the remnants of her previous power literally etched into the worn pavement where her SUV had once been, I felt the weight of what had transpired settle into the air around me, a dense, almost tangible tension that reminded everyone that actions, no matter how petty or arrogant, carry consequences beyond imagination, because the fallout had not only hit her legally and financially but psychologically as well, transforming a formerly confident, imperious figure into someone who moved cautiously, glanced over her shoulder, and spoke softly in corners where no one could hear. And yet, despite this dramatic reversal, the story didn't pause for relief, because the web she had woven over years had ensnared others, and unraveling it required more than a single legal battle or a single day of humiliation. It demanded meticulous planning, patience, and the willingness to watch as long-buried secrets finally surfaced. And as I began reviewing documents quietly collected from public records, old HOA notices, emails accidentally forwarded, and conversations captured on audio from previous board meetings, I realized that the depth of misconduct extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, including kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, unauthorized repairs billed to residents, inflated fines funneled into personal accounts, and shadow agreements with contractors who were conveniently related to board members, and each revelation added weight to the case that was no longer just mine, but the neighborhood's, the community's collective claim to truth and justice. And as neighbors slowly organized, forming committees to oversee the remaining board members, demanding transparency in every expenditure, vote, and communication, the former president's influence diminished with every meeting, every question, and every document presented, because power based on fear is ephemeral, and once visibility is introduced, fear turns into scrutiny, and scrutiny becomes accountability. And while this unfolded, I began receiving quiet, discreet messages from people who had once been too intimidated to speak, stories about fines for obscure infractions, letters threatening legal action over trivial complaints, and personal experiences of intimidation designed to enforce compliance. And as these narratives poured in, I realized that Section 7 wasn't simply about one car or one person being held accountable. It was about the cumulative weight of years of abuse finally breaking through the veneer of civility, and with that understanding came a strategic opportunity, because the more evidence surfaced, the less room there was for defense, the less opportunity there was for public manipulation or backroom deals, and by the time the local attorney general's office became involved, prompted by multiple complaints and a mounting dossier of financial and operational misconduct, the entire HOA structure was under scrutiny, not as rumor or gossip, but as a full legal inquiry, and this prompted resignations, forced audits, and an internal scramble to recover legitimacy. But legitimacy was a luxury no longer afforded to someone whose every action had been documented, photographed, recorded, and cross-referenced. And while all this unfolded in official channels, the social dimension remained just as potent. Neighbors, once cowed, now communicated freely, comparing documents, confirming suspicions, and collectively reclaiming a space that had been psychologically and financially manipulated. And as they shared stories, plotted reforms, and debated bylaws that would prevent similar overreach in the future, I realized the final lesson of Section 7. That long-term authority is only sustainable when it is earned, not demanded, and that a single act of courage, amplified by patience and careful strategy, can ignite a domino effect that alters the trajectory of an entire community. And as the former HOA president, now effectively sidelined and isolated, tried to navigate the rubble of her reputation, the legal battles, and the personal consequences, it became clear that her miscalculations, the SUV on my lawn, the impulsive threats, the panicked attempts at retaliation, were no longer merely embarrassing or inconvenient, but irreversibly transformative, a textbook example of how unchecked power, arrogance, and disregard for law eventually collide with accountability. And as I looked out across the neighborhood, seeing renewed gardens, children playing freely where once they had been monitored for trivial violations, and neighbors meeting without fear of fines or intimidation, I understood the final gravity of this section. Section 7 was the long arc of consequences, the point where chaos meets clarity, where fear dissolves into vigilance, and where a community, previously subdued and compliant, finally recognizes its agency, ensuring that no foam, no lawsuit, and no tyrannical board member could ever reclaim the ground that had been so decisively won. And while the tension of impending legal hearings, audits, and media coverage lingered like a shadow, there was also a profound sense of inevitability, that after all the scheming, the threats, the foam, the lawsuits, and the panic, justice, messy, slow, but uncompromising, had found its way to the front door, and no amount of denial or misdirection could erase it. The final chapter of this saga unfolded with a strange mixture of quiet satisfaction and tense anticipation, because after months of escalating chaos, legal battles, audits, and social upheaval, the former HOA president's influence had been reduced to a shadow, her once commanding presence now replaced by caution, invisibility, and the weight of consequences that could no longer be ignored. And as the new board, elected in a transparent vote for the first time in years, took control, implementing strict accountability measures, public audits, and community oversight, the neighborhood breathed collectively, as if a long-held breath had finally been released, and what had begun as a prank, a single SUV immobilized by expanding foam, had matured into a complete dismantling of a system that had been built on fear, arrogance, and unchecked authority, proving that no amount of titles, letters, or fines could substitute for legitimacy earned through respect, fairness, and transparency. And the former president, now legally restrained from taking unilateral action, faced the simultaneous collapse of her reputation, financial security, and social standing as lawsuits filed against her personally for misuse of HOA funds, intimidation, and trespassing continued to advance through the courts, exposing every misstep she had made over the years in meticulous detail, while neighbors, once cowed into silence, now spoke freely in meetings, on community boards, and in casual conversation, rewriting the narrative of their street, their community, and their lives with an unmistakable sense of empowerment. And as I walked past the spot where her SUV had once sat, scarred and immobilized by my carefully applied foam, I saw not just a reminder of her folly but a testament to the way patience, strategy, and measured action can turn the tide, because the story had evolved from a singular act of retribution into a broader lesson about accountability, justice, and the consequences of arrogance unchecked by law or ethics. And as the weeks passed, I watched the neighborhood transform. Lawns restored to perfection, block parties held without fear of fines, children riding bikes freely without surveillance, and conversations in doorways replacing the whispered fears of old. And while she attempted to regain some semblance of control, the legal system, the community, and the overwhelming documentation of her misdeeds ensured that every move was scrutinized, delayed, or blocked entirely, leaving her with nothing but the bitter awareness that she had overplayed her hand, misjudged the neighborhood, and underestimated a single homeowner willing to act decisively and legally to defend his property and dignity. And as the sun set on the final week of her reign, the community gathered on my lawn. Ironically, the same lawn where it all began, to celebrate the election of new board members, the installation of transparent financial controls, and a renewed commitment to fairness and mutual respect. And as neighbors toasted, laughed, and shared stories, I realized that Section 8 wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration, closure, and the profound satisfaction that comes when the arc of justice bends firmly toward those who uphold integrity, courage, and the rule of law. And in that moment, I understood fully that the expanding foam, the police involvement, the lawsuits, and the months of strategic action had achieved something far greater than I had initially imagined. Not just the humiliation of a tyrant, but the empowerment of an entire community, proving that one bold act, executed with patience and precision, can ripple outward, dismantling injustice, restoring balance, and leaving a legacy of vigilance and resilience that would endure far beyond the final legal filings, the repaired lawns, and the cleaned-up driveway. Because true victory is never just about winning against a single adversary, it's about ensuring that no one ever wields unchecked power again. And as I finally leaned against the porch railing, watching neighbors mingle under string lights, children laughing, and the street alive with life rather than fear, I knew without question that the saga had reached its natural conclusion. Justice had been served, the community restored, and the lesson learned that arrogance and abuse of power, no matter how carefully constructed, always meet their match in courage, strategy, and relentless perseverance.